The case of Jordan Worth, a sadist with an angelic face. Statistics on victims of domestic violence are not just difficult to keep, but virtually impossible, because many people simply do not seek help, not wanting to make a fool of themselves, so to speak. Sometimes people endure years of abuse, beatings, and humiliation, and some facts are revealed only when the irreparable happens. Simply put, these statistics are often based on dead bodies. The case of a young English woman named Jordan Worth made headlines across the country in 2018 and was in many ways, if not unique, then at least special. First, this fragile person with an angelic appearance destroyed the stereotype that cruel tyrants and abusers in relationships are men, because they are, trivially, stronger physically. And secondly, she became the first woman in British history to receive a real prison sentence for domestic violence and coercive control, because previously on such charges only men were imprisoned. Fortunately, tragedy was avoided in this story, but the very fact that a young woman and mother of 2 children almost tortured to death the father of her heirs causes, at the very least, bewilderment. And now let's understand how in principle such a situation could develop, and why Worth's chosen one, Alex Skel, tolerated inhuman treatment for so long and did not go to the police, even when his life was in real danger. Alex Skel's life before he met Jordan Worth. Alexander was born in 1995, August 17th, in a town called Kingston upon Hull, in a fairly well-to-do, friendly, and loving family. He and his twin brother were welcome and long-awaited children, but they were born much earlier than expected, because of which doctors seriously feared for them and did not make any prognosis. The boys spent the first months of their lives in the hospital, in special chambers for premature babies with critically low body weight. But thanks to the efforts of experienced doctors, the children soon recovered. True, Alexander's brother gained weight faster, and by the first birthday, he had practically no traces and consequences of prematurity. But Alex himself turned out to be weaker. Moreover, he suffered from excessive accumulation of fluid in the brain, hydrocephalus, because of which he received a disability. Nevertheless, Alexander's health problems from birth did not affect his intellectual development, and physically he was not much different from his peers, and even actively engaged in sports at school. Spouses Skel adored their sons, from infancy surrounded them with love and care, as well as spared no effort and money to give them a good education and provide a better life. After graduating from high school, both brothers entered the prestigious Bedford College, where they continued their studies. Alexander was smart enough, had an attractive appearance, tried to regularly attend the gym, and in general, enjoyed success with the opposite sex. Except that, unlike his brother, who willingly went on dates and had affairs, he was quite shy and more focused on his studies. Love at first sight. It was in college that Alex met a young beauty named Jordan Worth. The girl was his age, she grew up in a wealthy family, and from a young age she knew almost nothing to refuse. She dressed beautifully and expensively, carefully watched her appearance, and led an active social life. Jordan was considered one of the most popular girls in college, which tried to court many guys. In addition, she, in parallel with her studies, worked as a volunteer, raising funds and organizing assistance to local shelters for homeless animals, as well as starving children in Africa. Worth was even repeatedly recognized for her efforts, and for trying to make the world a better place. At first glance, this girl seemed a real angel in the flesh, kind, sympathetic, in addition, intelligent and beautiful. Alexander fell in love with her at first sight, but at first thought that bright and popular Jordan will not even pay attention to him. However, as it turned out, he also immediately appealed to her, and she herself became the initiator of their acquaintance. Worth was much more experienced in amorous affairs, but for modest Skel, she was the very first love of his life. Young people in love spent a lot of time together and were practically inseparable. In college, they were called the most beautiful couple, which was very flattering to Jordan. The first 6 months of the relationship were filled with love, romance, and mutual respect. Students tried to make each other pleasant surprises, gave cute gifts on small, but already so important for them dates. In their accounts in social networks daily appeared joint photos on which they were happy together. The pictures were accompanied by touching captions and declarations of love. From the outside, it seemed that these two were simply made for each other, and a long and happy life was ahead of them. Quite quickly, the young people decided to live together and rented an apartment. Since they were both still students, significant financial assistance was provided by their parents, who, by the way, were not against the relationship of the couple. Jordan even liked Alexander's parents because she seemed to be a serious girl, planned to become a teacher of art history, and in general made a positive impression on others. However, time passed, and Worth's behavior began to change. It all started with increased control, which increased with each month of their life together. The woman demanded from her young man to report to her every step, unapologetically checked his personal correspondence in the phone, email, as well as social networks, arranged wild scenes of jealousy literally in the same place and without any reason. Alexander tried not to pay attention to this because he was in love, and such behavior of his passions did not bother him too much. Even when the beloved began to choose his own clothes, forcing him to wear only what she buys, the guy wrote it off as care on her part. Soon the woman began to limit the circle of socialization of her boyfriend. Jordan herself chose with whom and when he can see, and with whom he can no longer keep in touch. Under this separation fell not only friends and fellow students of Skel, but also members of his family. As Worth got away with it, her boyfriend never complained to anyone, and they continued to look like a happy, perfect couple in public and on social media. The young lady began, literally, to revel in her impunity. She deleted contacts from Alexander's phone, without his knowledge blocked his family and friends, and even responded to messages on his behalf, often in a rude and insulting form. And after Jordan erased the correspondence, so that the guy did not even know what he said to people, from which they no longer wanted to communicate with him. The last straw and the breakup. The first alarm was raised by Alexander's twin brother, when Jordan began to prevent their communication. By that time, the parents of the brothers also noticed that Alex distanced himself from the family, and his beloved, and it all, began to avoid them, refusing to come to visit, even on holidays, and not wanting to communicate even on the phone. And on all attempts to get in touch with her, the woman was frankly rude. In those rare moments when the mother was able to get through to her son, she asked him to leave his chosen one, warning that nothing good will come out of this affair. But the young man in love did not want to listen to anyone and defended his girlfriend, claiming that she just so takes care of him and does not wish anyone anything bad. Soon the Skel family became aware that Worth forced their son to drop out of college, leave sports, and get a job. At the same time, the woman took away from her lover all the money he earned and spent it on his own needs and entertainment. Then the parents again made an attempt to talk to their son and convince him to leave Jordan, but their efforts were again unsuccessful. In 2013, during the celebration of his adulthood, Worth committed a disgusting act, which she got away with. On that day, she and her friends celebrated the solemn event in a country hotel, and at some point closer to the night, when the guests have already begun to disperse, the woman, without saying anything to anyone, simply disappeared. Alexander literally went crazy trying to find his beloved and worried that something might have happened to her. She returned to their room in the morning, being in a state of strong alcoholic intoxication. And when the guy tried to find out where she was, she just attacked him with fists and insults, and then laughed and said that she was going to report to him. 2 months later, while celebrating Alexander's own 18th birthday, Jordan got into a fight in front of her boyfriend's family and friends. She beat up a 15-year-old girl neighbor whom the Skel family knew well and had invited to the family party. Worth thought the woman was talking too sweetly to Alex, so she attacked her, pulling her hair and scratching her face. Jordan was barely calmed down, but it was clear to everyone what she was really like. After that, parents and brother insisted that Alexander broke up with the girl who behaved so aggressively and inadequately. Surprisingly, but the guy listened to them for the first time and agreed that his chosen one overreacted. The same evening he talked to her and said that he would not return to their apartment, but would stay to live in his parents' house. The reunion and the birth of their shared children. It's been almost 6 months since the couple broke up. Alex returned to his studies but continued to work. He almost no longer thought about Jordan, when on the eve of New Year's Eve 2014, she unexpectedly called and informed him that she was pregnant, and in the spring they would become parents. The guy was surprised and delighted with such news, and the woman apologized to him and said that she had not informed him earlier because she was sure that he did not want to see her anymore. The parents of the guy, having learned that they will soon have a grandchild, also melted, and themselves offered the woman to move into their house. Worth agreed and moved into the Skel family home. She officially married the father of her child, and 3 months later she and Alexander had a common son, William. The young parents and grandparents were unspeakably happy, and until about mid-fall 2014, they lived amicably and quietly. It was a short period when Jordan really cared about her chosen one, tried in every possible way to please him, and fell in love with the guy anew. When William was 6 months old, it turned out that the girl was pregnant again. At this time, she again became capricious and hysterical, and demanded from Alexander that they immediately move out of his parents' house. The guy wrote off such behavior on raging hormones, but agreed to rent them housing in the city, where they soon moved. In the summer of 2015, the couple had a second common child, a girl, to whom they gave the name Alice. Alexander was absolutely happy, and literally carried his wife and children in his arms. But Jordan, finally convinced that the chosen one will not go anywhere from her now, showed the darkest corners of her soul. The turning point. After the move, Worth again forbade her husband to communicate with his family and did not let his parents see their grandchildren. At the same time, the woman willingly accepted from them financial assistance, and sometimes even made Alex himself to ask his parents for money. In just a few months, she completely subjugated his will, breaking him psychologically, and took his life under her total control. Jordan regularly humiliated and insulted her husband, and at one point she started hitting him. At first, not violently, as if testing how he would react, how he would behave, and when the woman realized that her husband would tolerate everything, would not tell anyone, and nothing would happen to her for this. She gave free rein to her cruelty, displaying sophisticated sadistic tendencies towards him. It all started when they started renovating their house, and the woman was constantly dissatisfied with everything Alexander did. He carelessly noted that it was simply impossible to please her, after which a hammer flew into his head, leaving a deep wound. The bewildered guy fell down and almost lost consciousness. Clasping the wound with his hand, he felt blood running down his face. Then he asked his wife to help him or call an ambulance, to which she indifferently replied, "Crawl away somewhere and die," and then just went into another room to watch TV. Alex treated the head himself, didn't go to a doctor, and didn't say anything to anyone. From that moment on, Jordan was convinced that whatever she did, she could get away with it, and her husband would never complain to anyone, and certainly would not go to the hospital or the police. 3 years of hell. The next 3 years of his life turned out to be incessant moral and physical torture for Alexander, but he himself was already so depressed that he did not feel it, and did not even feel the threat hanging over him. He continued to work, tried to provide his family with everything they needed, but he became increasingly irritated and discontented with his wife, who now not only beat him every day, but also invented more and more sophisticated abuse. Now the young man was forbidden to sleep on the matrimonial bed, and instead he was confined to the floor, on the bedside mat, without a blanket or pillow, like a dog. He was also forbidden to enter the kitchen, and he could only eat what his wife and children did not finish. In fact, Alexander was starving, because he could not buy anything outside the house, because Jordan took away all his money. In addition, the woman deprived her husband of sleep and rest, having invented a new entertainment for herself. As soon as he fell asleep, she would beat him on the head, cut him, or pour boiling water on him. Skel later recalled waking up each time in savage pain, bloody or burned. After that, he would go to treat and bandage his wounds with improvised means, and his wife would go to bed quietly. Alexander perceived what was happening as something ordinary. He was finally broken morally and did not try to resist. The man completely stopped communicating with his parents and brother, and his wife, on his behalf, regularly asked them for money. Also financially helped them her parents so that the young woman could not deny herself anything. Skel lost a lot of weight and weighed already less than 50 pounds. In addition, his body was constantly covered with wounds, abrasions, burns, and hematomas, which could not but cause questions from others. At work, the guy was urged to go to the hospital, so his wife forced him to quit for fear of exposure. After the dismissal, he finally became a hostage of Jordan, who now abused him day and night. Long-awaited deliverance. Despite the horror that was going on in the couple's home, those around them still thought they were a happy family. Worth maintained social media pages on behalf of her husband, where she regularly posted old photos of them and their children, accompanied by captions about how in love they were and how lucky they were to have met each other. No one could even think that a woman with angelic looks and mother of 2 children behind closed doors turns into a real, sophisticated monster. She knocked out her husband's teeth, made a long and deep cut on his arm with a knife. His body did not come off the burns, but at the same time, he could not go to the hospital. And at home, from improvised, means he had only food film and tape, which he used to pull the wounds. Neighbors periodically heard screams coming from the house of the couple, and sometimes they were so disturbing that concerned people called the police. But Jordan each time managed to send away the law enforcers, convincing them that she and her husband were fine. However, during the next visit of the squad called by neighbors, one of the police officers noticed a man clutching a fresh wound and blood running down his arm. In addition, he looked emaciated and had bruises of varying degrees on his face. The girl tried to convince the officer that her husband was mentally unstable and sometimes self-mutilated. But this time the police called the paramedics and Alex was sent to the hospital. The doctors were literally shocked at the condition in which the young man was admitted. There was virtually no life on him, and his arm was so badly damaged that he was in danger of amputation. Alexander's body was covered with 2nd and 3rd degree burns. He weighed only 94 pounds. The ligaments of his shoulder were damaged from blows inflicted with a screwdriver, and there was a deep cut on his forearm, not counting the knocked-out teeth and numerous hematomas. At that time, Jordan burst into the hospital, demanding that her husband be handed over to her and assuring her that nothing terrible had happened to him and that he had done all the damage to himself. However, no one believed the distraught woman, and it was decided to take her to the station for questioning. Fair punishment. At first, Worth denied everything and stuck to the original version that her husband was self-harming. But when Alexander's parents arrived at the station, having visited their son in the hospital, the woman changed her face and began to describe in detail all the things she had done to her husband. She said she had trained him like a dog and he wouldn't get away from her. At the same time, Jordan insisted that her husband provoked her to be violent because he was allegedly cheating on her and pissing her off on purpose. She also continued to claim that he was mentally ill and had a tendency to self-injure. Naturally, all these testimonies categorically refuted the parents of the guy, but he himself did not immediately decide to testify against his wife. Only after undergoing a course of treatment and working with a psychologist, Alexander finally dared to talk about all the horrors that he had experienced in his own home in recent years. However, Worth was sure that she would face at most an administrative penalty, so she was not too worried about the upcoming trial. After hearing all the testimony, the judge found 22-year-old Worth guilty of willful infliction of grievous bodily harm, moral and physical abuse, and coercive control. She was sentenced to 7.5 years in prison. Even having 2 young children was not a mitigating factor for the sadist. Jordan was shocked by this sentence, and the case itself was unprecedented for the UK. The children were left in the care of their father and grandparents while their mother served her sentence. Alexander, having fully recovered and recovered from years of torture, became involved in community work and is now actively helping victims of domestic violence himself. On July 4, 2023, Jordan, having served 5 years of her 7.5-year sentence, was released on parole. However, the woman is forbidden to approach her former spouse and see their joint children. She is reportedly engaged to a bricklayer named Adam Steth and is preparing to become a mother for the 3rd time. The Irene Cortés case, an unfortunate accident or a contracted murder of a mother of many. They say a scorned woman is capable of unpredictable and desperate acts, with cold and cruel revenge being the most fearsome. But what about a scorned man? Many would say an offended man might resort to physical violence, drown his sorrows in alcohol, or combine these 2 scenarios. Yet men, generally less grudge-holding, can be more ingenious when it comes to revenge. The case of Irene Cortés, a Spanish citizen who met a mysterious end during a trip to Colombia, is complex and ambiguous. While her perpetrators were caught, convicted, and are currently serving long sentences, the deceased woman's family claims the real culprit remains at large and is portraying himself as a victim. Let's delve into this intricate story from the beginning and try to determine if a third party was involved, or if the murder was, indeed, unintentional. It's worth noting that each party involved is still trying to prove their version of the truth. Who was Irene Cortés? Irene Cortés, born Lucas, was born in 1980 in sunny Granada, Spain, the capital of the province of the same name. She grew up in a well-off family with a brother and sister. Her parents ran a small but profitable business. According to some reports, her father passed away early, but her mother, Maria Lucas, took over the business operations, expanded the enterprise, and ensured her children lacked for nothing. Maria's older brother, Uncle Pedro Lucas, was also a significant help. Irene was the eldest of the 3 children. A beautiful and sociable girl, she loved being the center of attention and attracted boys from an early age. Shortly after finishing school, she married and was already pregnant. At 17, she became a mother for the first time, and 2 years later, she had her 2nd child. Her mother and uncle provided considerable support, allowing her to pursue a good education despite early motherhood. In the early 2000s, Irene moved to the resort city of Malaga with her husband and 2 children. There, she opened an entertainment venue that quickly became popular and profitable. Initially a small disco bar, it eventually transformed into a full-fledged nightclub. In Malaga, the couple welcomed their 3rd child, and life seemed prosperous and stable. At 25, Irene's husband was arrested and sentenced to 5 years in prison for trafficking illegal substances. Tragically, he lost his life in prison under mysterious circumstances. The responsibility of raising the children fell solely on Irene's shoulders. Remembering how her mother single-handedly raised 3 children, Irene was determined to persevere. She successfully managed her business, earned well, and had big plans for the future. Relationship with Farid Henessaris. Farid Henessaris, a native of Barranquilla, Colombia, was born in 1976. Growing up in a large, impoverished family, he was the youngest of his siblings. His parents separated in the early 90s when he was still a teenager. His older siblings were independent by then, and Farid stayed with his mother. In 2001, at 25, Farid, along with his elderly mother, moved to Spain in search of a better life. They settled in Malaga, where Farid took any job he could to support himself and his mother. In 2005, he started working as a waiter at a nightclub owned by Irene. Irene immediately noticed Farid's hard work and reliability. She was also attracted to him, and Farid in turn did his best to please her. At the time, Irene's husband was incarcerated, and she planned to file for divorce but couldn't before her husband's untimely demise. Irene and Farid's employer-employee relationship soon blossomed into romance. Farid wasn't deterred by Irene's 3 children from previous relationships. Nor was Irene bothered by Farid's humble background as a waiter whose salary she paid. Within months of starting their relationship, the couple decided to move in together. They settled in Irene's spacious apartment, and soon after, Irene became pregnant with Farid's child. They went on to have 2 children together. It's unclear if they were officially married, but Irene kept her first husband's surname, while the children born with Farid carried the Henassaris surname. Imprisonment and infidelity. In 2009, Irene's past seemed to repeat itself. Like her first husband, Farid was arrested for distributing illegal substances and sent to prison. Once again, Irene was left alone, this time with 5 children. Farid was sentenced to 3 years, but served only 1.5, being released early for good behavior and cooperation with the investigation. However, soon after Farid's imprisonment, Irina found solace in the arms of another man and lived with him for those 1.5 years. Farid learned of her infidelity only after his release. Understandably furious, he threatened Irene and her lover and almost attacked the man, narrowly avoiding another legal issue. Eventually, they resolved the matter peacefully. Farid forgave Irene for the sake of their children, and they resumed living together as if there had been no imprisonment or infidelity. Irene's relatives were always skeptical about Farid. Her mother and uncle disapproved of their relationship, suspecting Farid was only interested in Irene's money. Also, Irene's older children from her first marriage never accepted Farid, while the youngest, whom Farid had raised since the child was 2, saw him as a father figure. Fateful trip to Colombia. In early 2011, Irene's husband, Farid, expressed the need to visit his homeland of Colombia due to his father's severe illness. Reportedly, Farid's estranged father was diagnosed with advanced cancer, and his sister in Barranquilla had informed him of the dire situation. Irene, who had long wished to visit Farid's homeland, decided to accompany him. She was eager to meet Farid's father, whom she had never met, and also experience the legendary Barranquilla Carnival, typically held in late February. Moreover, Irene, who hadn't taken a vacation for years due to her dedication to work and raising her 5 children, saw this trip as an opportunity for a much-needed break. The couple planned a 10-day trip across the ocean, with Irene's mother and younger sister agreeing to care for her children during this period. Despite her mother, Maria Lucas's attempts to dissuade her from the journey due to a bad premonition, Irene disregarded her concerns. At the same time, the family faced financial difficulties due to a seasonal downturn in their business. Despite this, Irene had personal savings of €3,000 in cash hidden at home. But on the eve of their trip, she discovered the money had mysteriously vanished, almost derailing their plans. Irene quickly borrowed the necessary funds from her uncle and close friends. She also booked their flight tickets and a hotel in the city center, thoroughly preparing for a journey that, tragically, would be her last. Mysterious murder. On February 27, 2011, the couple arrived in Colombia. The flight was uneventful, and they immediately checked into their hotel. Irene called home to reassure her mother. However, 2 days later, Farid informed Irene's eldest son, 14, of his mother's death. Initially, Farid claimed an accident, but it was soon revealed that Irene was murdered during a robbery at a Barranquilla entertainment venue. The case quickly became a major news story in Colombia. The narrative was that Irene, a Spanish tourist, was killed by robbers who fled the scene, triggering a citywide police manhunt. However, the circumstances of the robbery and murder seemed unusual and suspicious. The attackers did not appear to be trying to steal anything, but instead shot Irene in the heart and then fled in haste. Police and local media representatives quickly arrived on the scene. Despite the fact that Farid witnessed the shooting of his partner during an interview with journalists, he looked quite calm, not corresponding to the image of a grief-stricken widower. The Spanish embassy in Bogotá confirmed the murder, adding that Irene's remains will be repatriated after the necessary investigations. The exact events of the night of March 2nd have yet to be clarified by investigators. In the meantime, authorities are actively pursuing the attackers responsible for this senseless crime. Surveillance footage. The case of Irene Cortez's mysterious death seemed to gain clarity after reviewing surveillance footage from cameras installed at the location where the murder occurred. On March 1st, Irene and her partner, Farid Genesaris, had planned to meet Farid's brother, his sister, and their spouses. The group of 6 enjoyed the carnival, walked around town, and then, at Farid's suggestion, went to a local bar for dinner and entertainment. By 1 a.m., Irene, Farid, and his relatives were the only customers at the bar, as surveillance footage clearly shows. Around 2 a.m., 2 young men sitting away from the group entered the bar. They did not order anything and did not look comfortable, which caught the attention of the bar manager because of their suspicious behavior. Moreover, their young appearance made the manager check whether they were of legal age. The young men refused to show their IDs and, when asked to leave, one of them pulled out a gun and aimed it at the manager. His accomplice produced a knife, but soon retreated out of the camera's view. The armed assailant pushed the manager aside and approached Irene's table, announcing a robbery and demanding mobile phones and cash. His knife-wielding partner reappeared, presumably to collect valuables while the gunman kept the group under threat. However, he didn't get a chance to act. Confronting Irene, the gunman ordered Farid to stand for a pocket search. As Irene reached for her purse, the assailant lunged at her with the same hand holding the gun. A shot was fired as he grabbed the purse, striking Irene directly in the chest. She collapsed to the floor as the assailants fled without taking anything. Farid and his brother chased after them while his sister tried to stop Irene's bleeding, and his brother's wife called for emergency services. Unfortunately, the culprits were too fast to catch. The men returned to the bar, attempting to aid Irene, but it was too late. Emergency responders arrived quickly, yet Irene succumbed to her injuries en route to the hospital, leaving behind a baffling case and a grieving family. The hunt for the perpetrators, arrest and trial. In the wake of the robbery and homicide that took Irene Cortez's life, law enforcement mobilized all available resources. The city was teeming with tourists for the carnival, and ensuring their safety was paramount. A reward of 10 million pesos, about 3,500 euros, was announced for information leading to the culprits. The first suspect, the gunman Brian Dario, was apprehended the next day. He quickly implicated his accomplice, Juan Carlos. Juan, 18, surrendered to authorities, hoping for leniency. During interrogation, Dario claimed dire financial straits, debts, and a sick child in need of costly treatment drove him to the crime, corroborated later by his relatives. He maintained that Irene's shooting was accidental, occurring while trying to snatch her purse. Juan Carlos contended he was an unwitting participant. He said Brian didn't reveal his plans but asked for backup in a job. He claimed to have only a small knife for intimidation, not harm, and left the scene once he realized Brian's intentions. However, surveillance footage contradicted his claims, showing him returning to Brian. With both perpetrators in custody and their confessions, the case appeared solved, with prison sentences looming. The court found Dario guilty of robbery and homicide under aggravating circumstances, sentencing him to 23 years. Carlos received 17 years for complicity in these crimes. Accusations against Farid and new crime details. From the early stages of the investigation, the family of the deceased woman openly accused Farid of orchestrating the murder of his wife. Irene's mother and uncle hired a detective who conducted an independent investigation, gathering additional materials and evidence to hold the man accountable and prove his involvement in the crime. Starting with the earlier mentioned disappearance of 3,000 euros from the hiding place in Cortez's house. According to Maria Lucas, only Farid knew about this money, and he was the only one who could have discreetly taken it. The woman told her daughter about this from the beginning, but she did not want to listen. Now, she believed that her son-in-law used this money to pay Dario to kill his wife. Another weighty argument was the fabricated illness of the man's father, whom he was so eager to visit. It turned out that no cancer diagnosis was made for the elderly parent, and he was quite healthy for his age. Farid concocted this story, making it the main pretext for the trip to Colombia. Also, it was Genesaris who initiated the visit to that fateful establishment. Moreover, he insisted on continuing the feast deep into the night when all the other visitors had long dispersed. and their company was alone in the hall. Further, the detective conducted a detailed analysis of those very recordings from the cameras, giving an assessment of what was happening and making his own conclusions. He noticed that the criminals acted strangely. Juan was clearly scared and most likely really did not understand what was happening while Brian approached the company, came up to Farid and raised him, but did not directly threaten him with a gun. It looked like the men knew each other and acted cohesively. Then Farid, strangely, moved behind Irene, who was sitting at the table. When she reached into her bag to get her wallet, the criminal with the gun looked at the man as if waiting for a signal. It's hard to say exactly whether he received any kind of sign, as the victim and her husband were back to the camera. After the shot, the man chased the killer, but, in the expert's opinion, he deliberately let him escape. However, the latter statement can be considered controversial, as Brian was armed with a gun and Farid could reasonably fear for his life. Also in question was the man's behavior after his chosen one was declared dead. He willingly gave interviews to the arrived correspondents, talked about the details of what happened, and, at the same time, did not look too upset or depressed. Another important question: why, after the tragedy, did Genesaris call not Irene's mother, not her uncle, or any of the adult relatives, but dialed the number of her 14-year-old son to tell him about his mother's death? According to Maria Lucas, he wanted to personally inflict pain on the teenager, punishing him for not recognizing the stepfather's authority and treating him disrespectfully. The woman's uncle was the first to dare to give an interview in the press and openly talk about his suspicions and the results of the investigation. Pedro Lucas was sure that Farid planned the trip in advance, essentially luring Irene into a trap. The money stolen from her was used to pay for the services of a hired killer, and after her death, he planned to establish guardianship over the children and take over the business of his deceased wife. Farid's mother did not silently listen to her son being accused of a terrible crime and openly stood up for her offspring. The woman claimed that her offspring was madly in love with Irene and her children and would never harm her. However, in the end, the parent inadvertently let slip a phrase about the chosen one not having to cheat on Farid, as this greatly offended his pride. Also, an unpleasant detail emerged about Genesaris leaving Spain on fake documents, as he was not allowed to leave the country because he had recently been released from prison on parole. The man himself denied this information, stating that he left legally, and Irene acted as his guarantor. Funeral. Without the widower. 12 days after the tragedy, Irene's body was returned to her native Spain. The funeral was conducted with a closed casket, as the remains had begun to decompose after such an extended period. Hundreds attended the funeral: family, friends, neighbors, and even those who didn't personally know Cortés, but had heard about the resonant story and wanted to express their condolences to the family. The only person missing from the farewell ceremony was Farid, who simply feared returning from Colombia, apprehensive of retribution. Farid claimed that the relatives of his late wife had repeatedly threatened him and his elderly mother. For this reason, before flying back to Spain, he intended to appeal to the authorities to ensure his safety. He sought a protective order to be able to attend the funeral, but his request was denied, and Genesaris decided not to take the risk. In turn, Farid filed a complaint in court against the relatives of his deceased wife, who, he alleged, hindered his return home. However, Maria and Pedro Lucas denied his claims, stating they were most interested in his return to face trial in Spain. Additional court proceedings. With new circumstances and accusations against Farid, an additional investigation and court proceedings were conducted. Dario and Carlos, already serving their sentences in a Colombian prison, were interrogated about their acquaintance with Genesaris and a possible premeditated conspiracy. However, Brian categorically denied this assumption. He continued to insist that the murder was an accidental result of a failed robbery attempt. He claimed he had never seen Farid before, let alone been hired as a hitman for his wife. The accusations indeed seemed to be grasping at straws, with no irrefutable evidence of premeditation or a contract killing, only assumptions and interpretations of the events on the recording. Dario also confessed that he was under the influence of alcohol and prohibited substances that evening, hence his poor recollection of the event's chronology. As for Carlos, he maintained that his friend did not involve him in his plans, and everything that happened in the bar was as shocking to him as it was to those they attacked. Blon appeared to be telling the truth, but Brian's words, who made the fatal shot, raised some doubts. Consider this. He failed to commit the robbery, ended up in prison, but his sick child still received the necessary expensive treatment. Brian claimed that kind-hearted people, learning about his motive, helped him. However, the Lucas family's lawyers tried to prove that the €3,000 stolen from Irene, which Farid paid for her murder, were spent on the treatment. Supposedly, Brian agreed to sacrifice himself and go to prison to save his child and secretly pass the money to his wife. This version, however, was never proven. Returned to Spain. Only after obtaining a court order that guaranteed his safety did Genesaris decide to return to Spain. Several months had passed since the tragedy, and the media frenzy had subsided. Upon his return, Genesaris claimed to have brought investigation materials proving his innocence in his wife's murder. He cited his main reason for returning as a desire to care for the children he shared with Irene, who had been under the care of the deceased's relatives during his absence. 6 months later, Farid decided to give a major interview, in which he revealed that he had lost virtually everything. He was jobless, his passport had been annulled, preventing him from leaving the country, and to add insult to injury, his friends had turned their backs on him, and the mother and uncle of his late wife forbade him from seeing his children. Genesaris repeatedly faced Maria and Pedro Lucas in court. He accused them of threatening him while they attempted to prove his involvement in Irene's murder. However, neither side could substantiate their claims. Ultimately, the children remained in the custody of their grandmother and uncle, and the widower was unable to claim any of his late wife's property. Corpus Christi resident Kevin Davis strangled his mother before hitting her in the head with a hammer, splitting her skull. Davis then swirled her brain around before sexually assaulting her corpse. Davis was sentenced to life in prison for the crime of a mom who he described as the best. In 2014, Kevin Jazreel Davis argued with his mother, 50-year-old Kimberly Hill, in the Corpus Christi, TX, apartment he shared with her and his sister, Destiny. On May 26th, Davis called 911, reporting that he'd just murdered his mother. Once at the police station, an 18-year-old Davis vividly detailed the day's events, sometimes with a smirk on his face. What he told detectives was gruesome and shocking. Kevin admitted bashing in Hill's head with a hammer, swirling her brain around, and then sexually assaulting her corpse. On the morning of March 27, 2014, Davis, bored and frustrated with life, told his mother he did not like people and that he wanted to commit suicide. Obviously caught off guard by the statement, Hill allegedly told her son that she could not stop him if that was what he wanted to do. Kevin later told police hearing this from his mother enraged him. It was then he decided to take her life. As Hill sat on the couch in the living room, Davis came up behind her, attempting to strangle her with a cord. Hill began screaming. Kevin panicked, retrieved a hammer, and began bashing in his mother's skull. Davis struck his mother in the head with the hammer at least 20 times, splitting her skull in the process. Davis then retrieved a kitchen knife that he inserted inside his mother's head wound. He swirled her brain around to make sure she was dead, Kevin claimed, and then inserted his hand inside the wound. He would tell detectives during a taped interrogation that his mother's brain felt like putty. Kevin then dragged his mother's lifeless body to her bedroom and raped her corpse. When he finished the sadistic act, he went to a neighbor's house, saying he just killed someone and needed help. The neighbor dialed 911. Police arrested Davis without incident. At the police station, he made a full confession of the crime, giving details that even seasoned detectives found highly disturbing. Watch part of Kevin Davis's confession. During the interrogation, Davis told detectives that he originally planned on killing his sister, too, but changed his mind. He further admitted that he often fantasized about having sex with dead bodies. With a smirk on his face, Kevin also told the detective that he was a virgin before he raped his mother. He stated, "I guess I've lost my virginity to a corpse," as he gently laughed. What did Kimberly Hill do to warrant such a violent death? Nothing warrants a son murdering than sexually assaulting his mother, of course, and Kevin could not give detectives one good reason for the crime. According to Kevin, she was a great mom that did not deserve what he had done to her. He said that she was the best mother in the world, and went on to say, "I am a terrible, disgusting person." Kevin admitted that he had the best mother in the world, telling detectives that she did nothing to deserve what was done to her. He went on to say that he was a terrible, disgusting person. In reality, Kevin was a serial killer in the making, a psychopath who took sadistic pleasure in hurting other people. Although diagnosed by a psychologist with antisocial personality disorder, the doctor said he knew right from wrong when he brutally murdered and raped his mother. He readily admitted that he would kill again if ever released from prison. He also confessed to then fleeing the crime scene on his bicycle. Before he did that, though, he left several handwritten notes for the police, one of which read, "Chase me. Sorry for the mess. KD." But after a while, he decided against leaving town and called 911 to report his mother's killing and his crimes. Despite admitting to the murder and making a videotape confession, Kevin Davis pleaded not guilty to the charges in court. He later changed the plea. Davis smiled at the jury as they sentenced him to life in prison. He serves his time at the Jester 4 facility in Richmond, Texas, and is eligible for parole in March 2044. Story number 2. Story of the Killer Priest. We will be exploring the story of a killer, a priest that seemed to be normal, nothing strange or nothing weird about him. However, he did have a dark side. It turns out that not only was he a pervert, but he was manipulating people as he saw fit, especially women. And now, without further ado, let's dive into the story of gore. We're going back in time in the 50s in France, and we need to take note that the church at that time had a very important place in people's lives. Especially in the countryside, the priests were almost as important as the mayors because they were representing a type of moral authority that many people listened to. And this was the case in the small village of Europe where this story took place. A town that had about 400 villagers, Gore was born on the countryside, and his family was very Catholic. They raised him so that he can have a career in religion as a priest, and even if that was not his first choice, that is exactly what he became. It is in 1950 that Guy became a priest at the Church of Europe. In appearance, this young man looked like the ideal priest. He was nice, friendly, kind, and very dynamic. Anything linked to religion, he did it very, very well. He had a lot of great ideas to help the village grow. He created a choir, a group to play in a theater piece. He did organize multiple excursions for the kids, and he was known to have created a soccer team for the boys of the village. The older people thought that it was very modern for him to bring all these items to the village, and the younger generation thought it was pretty amazing and appreciated the modern aspect that he brought to the town and to the religion. Dewar was apparently also a beautiful man, and the ladies found him very charming. Now, as I have mentioned at the beginning, underneath this whole angelic disguise guy was actually hiding a dark secret. His personality, he had a thirst for kollel pleasure, and he was using his charm to get closer to the ladies. After a lot of perversity and manipulation, a lot of the women actually gave in, and none of the women spoke as they were afraid that no one would believe them and did not want to be seen as the shame of the village. It is in 1953 that things took a different turn for Guy Dyer, and an incident happened that changed the plan of the priest. A girl fell for his charm, and guess what happened? She became pregnant. Now, of course, the priest denies everything, and he says that he is not the father. He threatens the girl and says that if she does not stop, he will file a complaint for defamation. Now, having a eye influence in the village, Guy says that this is nonsense, and it is impossible for him to be the father. And of course, having such an high influence, his followers believed him. He was even summoned in front of his superior, the bishop, to which he lied to you and denied the whole thing. And of course, this whole situation was shut down in reality. He was actually the father, and he actually took the girl to another village to give birth, where he convinced her to give away the child. And of course, that story was never heard of or told to the villagers, or we could say maybe presume that if people knew, they decided not to say anything, because the priests had such a high influence on the villagers that they did not want to go against him. Once the story died, Guy went back to his normal ways and kept manipulating the people like he did before. But there was another incident in 1956. Reen Faze, 19 years of age, got pregnant, and again by Guy Dyer. Contrary to the other women, Reen did not want to give away her child for adoption. Not only that, but she wanted to raise him in the village of the Uref, where the priest Guy was terrified, and he was afraid that eventually the child would grow up and resemble him. He was also afraid that this woman would actually speak. Eventually, speaking of which, in 1956, rumors started to make surface. A lot of parishioners were becoming pregnant in mysterious ways, and no one knew who the father was. The priest then starts to think about a plan and ask a military man from another village to come to town and pretend that he was the father. Unfortunately, that strategy did not work out, and no one believed the soldier was the father. That only made things worse for the mysterious pregnancies. December 3rd, 1956 is a date that changed everything, for the priest Kai brings Rain in on a deserted road to try and convince her one more time to give up the child. She refuses again, and she was tired of the priest's request. So you know what she did. She got out of the car and started to walk back the opposite way back to the village. At night, Guy Dyer got out of the car and pulled out a 6.35 caliber pistol and fired 3 shots. The 3 shot hit Regine in the back of the neck, and she died on the spot. Once the crime committed, the priest walked to the victim, undressed her, and took out a knife and started to open Regine's stomach. From her stomach, he removed the baby girl that was still alive. The priest committed again an act that cannot be forgiven. He strangled the baby, stabbed it, disfigured it, and he did all the thinking to himself that, if the baby is massacred that way, there would be no DNA, if you want to call it that way, no DNA to trace the baby back to him. The disappearance of Regine was actually reported in the evening, and the weird part is that the priest joined the search party to find Regine. Can you imagine that situation? I mean, the killer is with you in the search party trying to find the person that he just murdered. Is it just me, or that is just like Twisted? The body was found very quickly, and because the priest was not an assassin, he didn't, think about cleaning up the crime scene, so it didn't take long for the cops to find the murder weapon, and they found the weapon casing that linked back to the priest. So the priest is now a suspect, and when asked during the interrogation, the priest denied everything. However, because of all the pressure he was getting, he just cracked and admitted everything. Now that story came out, and everyone was devastated in France because he is now a criminal, and the church asked for Guy to be locked up with a false name so that it would not affect the church, and also the main reason was to make sure that the crime was not associated to the church. The court addressed the case of Guy Denoyer on January 24th, 1958. Of course, the villagers and the public opinion wanted the priest to be sentenced to death. The life of Guy was defined as a person that did enjoy luxury, sexual relations, and admired his own authority, and on his side, the priest was asking forgiveness because he had no clue what he did wrong. The jury did provide their verdict, and for most, they said that he was guilty of double murder. Of course, there was Regine and the baby. However, they did not want to sentence him to death. The jury did not want to send someone associated to the church to the scaffold. The priest Guy Denoyer was therefore sentenced to perpetrated work. Now that situation raised a lot of questions regarding the responsibility of the Catholic Church, and this is still a question that is being asked nowadays, especially for the priests who like other kids, if you know what I mean. There was an investigation that was done, and the report came up saying that the church knew the dark side that he was hiding before he was pronounced priest. His superiors noticed that he did not have a lot of faith, and he was not really a believer in Catholic religion. The investigation did show that before being priest in a Uref, he was sent to Blemont. While he was there, he did have a sexual relation with his parishioner, and instead of removing his status, they just transferred him to another city. Even there, his weakness for women did not stop, as he did have multiple sexual relations. You would think that the church would revoke his status, but instead he was just transferred to Europe, where the church was isolated and his temptations might be lower. But as we have seen, this was not the case. De Noyer was released in 1972. After being detained for 22 years, he was the oldest prisoner of France. Once again, the church came to his help after he was released from prison. He was welcome in a monastery in Brittany, where he stayed there until he died on April 21st, 2010, at 90 years of age. Now we go to story number 3. Family slaughtered at Wellscrape Provincial Park. The killer stalked the family while he let his violent fantasies run wild. 3 generations of a family left to go camping on August 2nd, 1982. They set up camp in the Wellscrape Provincial Park, located roughly 120 kilometers north of Kamloops in central British Columbia. They enjoyed several days of cloudy family time, picking berries during the day and gathering around the fire at night, having no idea that they were being stalked by a killer. Among the campers was grandparents Edith, 59, and George Bentley, aged 66, their daughter Jackie, 41, and son-in-law Bob Johnson, 44. Also the Johnsons' daughters Janet, 13, and Karen, just 11. The Johnsons drove up with their daughters and pitched a tent for the girls. The grandparents brought a truck and camper where the adults would stay. The last anyone heard from the family was on August 6th, when Edith called another daughter. It would not be until August 23rd that the family would first be reported missing. Bob Johnson was due back at work on August 16th, but didn't show. After a week with no word from him, his company filed a missing persons case with the police. In spite of an extensive search, it didn't result in finding any of the family members. The biggest problems were the killer had a head start. With plenty of time to kill, get rid of the victims' bodies, and cover his tracks. The other, maybe even bigger obstacle was, no one knew exactly where the family was camping at. All anyone knew was that the family was camping in the Wellscrape area, which is massive. They had no idea where to even start, let alone being able to follow a trail to find the family. It would take 3 more weeks and a mushroom picker to find the family. On September 13th, the current discovery of the Johnsons' 1979 Plymouth was found. It had been burned beyond recognition as it set off to the side of a mountainside logging road. The car held the bodies of the 4 adults in the back seat and the 2 young girls in the trunk. The bodies were burned so thoroughly that when it came time to bury the family, they were all placed together in one child-sized casket. Through a forensic examination of the remains, it was determined they had been shot with a .22 caliber firearm. Locals were able to tell investigators where they had seen the family camped at. An examination of the area would turn up .22 casings, which helped identify the weapon used as a Remington pump-action rifle. What wasn't at the campsite was the truck and camper, the boat, and camping gear brought with the family, or any trace of the family at all. With no suspect in custody or even in sight, the media was pushing for answers. A tip came in that the family's truck and camper had been spotted. The witnesses said it was being driven by 2 French Canadians in central Canada. The media sprang into action, throwing this up as their headline and demanding the killers to be caught. In April, with still no leads, the investigators knew they needed to get creative. They reenacted what they believed was the crime scene for TV cameras and aired it across Canada. The next month, the police drove a replica Ford camper truck to Ontario and Quebec, in an attempt to draw awareness for what people should be looking out for. What it did instead was flood the investigators with over 13,000 tips and sightings of the replica vehicle. The reward was raised from $7,500 to $10,000 for information leading to the truck. None of the tips led to the discovery of the camper and truck. It would be found by sheer luck. 2 forestry employees were working on a logging road and stumbled across it. The camper had sat there on Trophy Mountain for 14 months, only a few kilometers away from the crime scene. The camper was burned out like the car holding the family's bodies. This left the authorities to believe they were looking for someone local to the Wells Gray area, and not two French Canadians as they had been searching for, since it was more likely that a local would know about the logging roads and the area in general. Taking a closer look at the person who lived closest to the crime scene led them back to David William Shearing, 24. They had received a tip about him earlier in the investigation. When they followed up, the tipster had quite a bit to tell them. A year earlier, Shearing had asked him about re-registering a Ford truck and how to repair a hole in its door. This was a tip that the police had never divulged. After finding the truck, it had a bullet hole in the door. After an interrogation by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, Shearing confessed. He went so far as reenacting the murders for the detectives. He turned over evidence that he had stolen from the family and the murder weapon, the .22 caliber Remington rifle. The ballistic test would prove that this was the weapon used to kill the family. The same weapon that had been hanging on his wall the very first time the authorities went to ask him about the family, right after they had been reported missing. Maybe it was because his father was a prison guard or his brother was a sheriff. But Shearing wasn't suspected when first interviewed. In his confession, he gave details of how it all happened. He had first noticed the family when he set up camp, fixating on the two young girls. Then over the next few days, he watched their every move. On the night of August 10th, Shearing watched as the adults sat around the campfire and had seen the girls go into their tent for the night. From a distance, he took out the 4 adults with sniper shots. He said he then killed the 2 girls from their tent as they slept. After he said he loaded all the bodies into the car and moved it to the logging road, then set it on fire with 5 gallons of gasoline. He then cleaned up the campground, removing the family's possessions, including the camper and truck. It would only be later that he burned these as he was unable to transfer them into his name. He claimed that he killed the family because he wanted to rob them of their possessions. It wouldn't be until after Shearing was convicted that he gave his full confession of how he had been stalking the family. It was the girls that he fantasized about having sex with that kept him interested. That's why after killing the adults, he kidnapped the girls and took them to his property nearby. There he raped and terrorized them for over a week. On August 16th, the day their father was due back at work, Shearing took Taryn away from her big sister. Once alone, he shot the girl in the back of the head. Janet would be left alive for one more day of torture before she would be killed like her sister. With the girls now dead, he took their bodies to the Johnsons' car where the other family members had been placed. He had actually only hidden the car in some bush. He put the girls in the trunk and got into the driver's seat with the 4 decomposing adult bodies in the back seat, driving it to its final resting place where it would be found by that mushroom picker burned out. David Shearing pled guilty to 6 counts of murder. Shearing was sentenced to life in prison with no eligibility for parole for 25 years. The maximum penalty for second-degree murder. This would be the first time that this sentence was handed out in Canadian history. David Shearing, who changed his last name to his mother's maiden name of Ennis, was first eligible for parole in 2008. The National Parole Board ruled against his release, citing that he was still having violent sexual fantasies and had not completed a sex offender treatment program, so he was not ready to be released. Again in 2012, he was turned down for parole, applying again in 2014, but before his hearing, he withdrew his request. The National Parole Board has also been given a petition which has over 15,000 signatures, advocating for the violent offender to never be released. In his own words at one of his parole hearings, David tries to plead for freedom, saying this about himself: "I was very selfish." He is supported by his wife, that he married while in prison, Heather,